Okay.
And I want to thank Katie Adams and
What is she, a dog?
Candace Bannister, and I think we ought to take a little time to remember, since this is the 60th anniversary of Tread of Pioneers, we should remember Dorothy and Francis Wither, who founded the organization, and the Wither family over the years has contributed so much to this institution, and they continue to do that. Last summer, Cindy Wither had an exhibit of her watercolors here, and as you heard Katie say, later on there will be a Wither cousin, one of them who will talk about a Wither childhood here. And that makes me think of something that John and Cindy did a number of years ago. My late friend and classmate John Wither and Cindy arranged with a professional writer and editor to interview his mother, Frances Wither, and the writer took the interview and turned it into a memoir, and that was published in book form, just intended mostly for family and friends. But there is a copy available in the Bud Werner Library in the locked case they keep there with local books. And I discovered that, and I have to confess this, I didn't do my homework, because when I looked at that list, I realized that there aren't just a few books written about Steamboat. There are 150 books in that case. And I can't pretend to have read more than a few of those. But I decided I'd better limit the talk, and even so, I came up with 9 titles that I'd like to talk a little bit about. This is going to be a little bit like a smorgasbord. I'm going to just talk a little bit about the writer and then tell you a little bit about the book, and I'll be passing a copy of each book around so you can get a look at it. And if you remind me that this can't go on all day, that you've got classes to go to after this one, I will shut off my perpetual fountain of words and let you people have a little chance to say something, because I'd like to know what you think about these books, and some of you probably know more about some of the authors and the books than I ever will. So let's see what we can find out from this. And I'd like to start first with Lalita Crawford Pritchett in a book called The Cabin at Medicine Springs. It's a children's book, and it was published in 1958, excuse me. And if you'll just pass this around so everybody gets a chance to see these. Lalita Crawford Pritchett was the granddaughter of the founder of Steamboat Springs, James H. Crawford. Her mother, Lulie Crawford, I guess Lalita was named after her mother. Lulie Crawford was a child when the Crawford family moved here. And Lalita tells about that journey by wagon from Denver over the mountain passes. This was at a time before there were roads, highways of any sort. Of course, cars hadn't been invented, early 1870s. So you can imagine what it would have been like to drive a wagon over here from Denver. They did that, and they settled here near the Steamboat Springs, which the Ute Indians who summered here used to call the Medicine Springs. And that's the reason the title of the book is The Cabin at Medicine Springs. What was taking place during the time of the story of the Cabinet Medicine Springs was James Crawford's attempt to get a team of surveyors here from Denver so they could survey the land so he could then go to Denver and make his claim to the land official. But it had to be surveyed before he could do that. At the same time he was trying to do that, a guy named Nathan Meeker, who was the Indian agent down at the White River Agency, was plowing up the racetrack of the Ute Indians. Probably the stupidest thing ever done in Colorado. And I say that being one of those who probably makes the top 10 list for doing stupid things in the state. When he plowed up the racetrack, the Utes killed him, and they took the women, and that all of that takes place during the story of the Cabinet Medicine Springs. The tale is beautifully told, I think. The language is clear. It's written for an audience of children, but I think adults can read it with pleasure. And I would mention that I was told by Katie that the Tread of Pioneers each year gives each second grader in the Steamboat schools their own copy of the Cabinet Medicine Springs. I think that's terrific. I think that's just great. I think that the Cabinet at Medicine Springs deserves to be ranked with the Little House on the Prairie books, which are one of the great achievements in American children's literature. In fact, I think Lalita was probably intending to write a series of books, because she did start out with the Shining Mountains and then moved on to the Cabinet Medicine Springs. Why she didn't continue to write more books in that series, I have no idea. Maybe some of you do, so that's one reason I want to save time for your comments later on. But she didn't. Lalita herself, her family came to Steamboat. She was born in Denver, I believe, and the Pritchetts moved to Steamboat in the early years of the 20th century, and she went to school here and graduated from Steamboat High at the age of 16 as class valedictorian, and she went on to get a degree at University of Denver, and then she went to Park School of Business Administration in Denver. She eventually got a job with an engineering firm in Denver and worked there from 1939 until her retirement in 1974. She was a writer her whole life. She started writing at a very young age, wrote stories, poems. Many of them were published. And after the Cabinet Medicine Springs, she continued to write about Steamboat, but she did so in little historical booklets, and you've probably seen them if you've been at Tread of the Pioneers before, because I think it was Tread of Pioneers that actually published a lot of those. But she didn't publish any more novels, and I picked this novel because it's about childhood, and I decided to focus on books about childhood in Steamboat Springs, because every time I meet somebody who's been to Steamboat at some time and they find out that I grew up in Steamboat, they say, that must have been great. It must have been like a child's paradise. And I always say, yeah, it was. And for me, it pretty much was. But not for everybody who was a child here. And some of the books I'm going to talk about have a somewhat different story. And the second book is by Lucille Bogue. And she deserves, like Lalita, she deserves a biography of her own. I'll just say a few things about her. she had to suffer through me and Moose Burroughs and our classmates because she was our senior English teacher. And she was also the founder of Yampa Valley College, which became, well, it was sold off to some outfit called International University or something. I didn't follow that whole transfer, and finally it ended up in the Colorado Mountain College system of state schools, and is still here, I think, isn't it? Still going on. And Mrs. Bogue was a writer, I think, probably pretty much her whole life too. She was born near Glenwood Springs and grew up on the western slope, and her grandfather, in fact, homesteaded near what is now Rifle, Colorado, and the town of Rifle was founded, according to what I read, because his widow sold off lots of some of that land, and the people who bought the land started building their houses there, and there was Rifle, Colorado. But Mrs. Bogue eventually moved to Steamboat and became a teacher here, survived me and my classmates, and went on to become the president of the Yampa Valley College, and she wrote the first history of Perry Mansfield Camp. And I think that's really important because she knew that that was an institution that was very remarkable, and there needed to be some record of it. And that book's called Dancers on Horseback and was published in 1984. She wrote Blood on the Wind, the memoirs of Flying Horse Molly, a Yampa Ute, when she was almost 90 years old. It was published the year she turned 90. So don't tell me, folks, that you can't write something because you're too old, you just can't take pen to paper. You can do it if you want to. You just have to do it. You can see I'm warming up to a homework assignment.
Have you done it?
I've done it. You're going to hear me talk about my sins here in a minute.
How many times?
Too often. The next author's John Rolfe Burroughs. When I was a kid, we called him Johnny Burroughs, and he was, as the paper you all have a copy of, as it points out, he was born in 1902, and he starts his childhood memoir headfirst in the pickle barrel. He starts it by a scene when his father's walking down the stairs at the Onyx Hotel and falls and almost spills the milk that was intended for baby Johnny. But Johnny Burroughs went on to study at the University of Arizona, and then he went to Harvard Business School of Administration. And then, I don't know how this happened, maybe somebody here does, he went on to work for a company in the Pacific, and he was working on Wake Island in 1944. You know what happened. The Japanese invaded. They took Johnny prisoner. He was held in a labor camp for the duration of the war. He was, I don't know this for certain, but my guess is he was tortured, beaten. I know he was nearly starved to death because people said when he got home, and he'd been eating for a few weeks before he got home, he looked like he was almost dead.
He was in the Bataan Death March.
He was. I thought I had a memory of that, but I didn't recall it. But the Bataan Death March. So he came back. When I was a kid, you wouldn't have known he'd been through all that. He seemed like a jolly guy. I never talked to him that much, but my dad knew that I had aspirations to be a writer myself someday, So he asked Johnny if Johnny would give me some advice. So one day I found myself knocking on Johnny's door, and he talked to me, he gave me advice. I can't remember what it was now. I'm sure it was good advice, but as was so often the case when I was a child, I didn't follow good advice. I followed the other kind, I'm afraid. But Johnny was a writer, I think, pretty much his whole life too, and he wrote quite a few books besides Head First in the Pickle Barrel. I think a book or two about Steamboat Springs too, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Did he write the book about Buddy Werner?
Yes.
Yeah.
He wrote other ones too.
I'm going to mention another book of his when we get a few more books down the list. But I forgot to pass around a copy of Blood on the Wind. Let me do that now. And here's Head First in the Pickle Barrel, and I'd like to read the passage from it that gives the book its title. Johnny went shopping with his mother when he was a small boy, and they went into a meat market, Mr. Franz's meat market, and Mr. Franz, every time little Johnny came in, he would let Johnny take a pickle out of the pickle barrel. So without saying anything more, I'll let Johnny tell you about this himself. Whenever I expressed a preference for pickles, he would boost me onto the counter, hand me the dipper, and let me do my own fishing. This was high adventure, for the undertaking was by no means devoid of risk. If the pickle barrel was full, or nearly full, there wasn't any problem. If the barrel was only half full, I would lie at full length on the counter, grabbing its edge with my left hand, and fish with the dipper in my right hand, my head and shoulder well within the barrel. But one time the barrel was nearly empty. Having hoisted me to the counter, Mr. Franz turned to answer Mother's question about a rolled roast, while I, inching along the counter, made cast after cast, but only encountered space. Nothing if not an activist, and even thus early in life, trained by my father to persevere in any task I undertook, I threw caution to the winds, grasped the ladle in both hands, and leaning far over, took a magnificent swipe at that pickle barrel's Stygian interior. All objects, even small boys, possess a center of gravity. And as my own slipped over the tip of the barrel, Mr. Franz lunged wildly. He succeeded in grabbing me by the seat of the pants, but this proved to be too little, too late. My galluses slipped over my shoulders, and I plunked head first and bare-bottomed to the bottom of the barrel amid the pickles I coveted. But even in the midst of this harrowing experience, I displayed what, in my estimation, was commendable presence of mind. When gasping and choking like a beached whale, I was lifted out of the barrel. Clutched in each of my fists was a big dill pickle. I think Johnny's memoir has a narrative voice that's sort of a combination of Washington Irving and Mark Twain, and it's I think another book that deserves the attention of adults as well as children. The next writer I'd like to talk about is Marcellus Maro. And I had to bend my rules a little bit to fit him in because, like another one or two of the writers on this list, he didn't actually write, he wrote every word in this book, but he didn't write it as a book. And those of you who lived in Steamboat back in the days when I was a pup, you know that Marcellus Maro would write these long letters to the Steamboat pilot. And Morris Leckenby would publish those long letters. Well, not that long ago, in fact, let's see, just 11 years ago, Marcellus Maro's grandson, David Maro Primus, gathered those letters together, did some arranging and some editing, and published them in book form. And the title is Steamboat Springs, Memories of a Young Colorado Pioneer. Now Marcellus, notice that his date of birth is just a year before Johnny Burroughs. He was born in 1901. So of course he and Johnny knew each other. And Marcellus, he went to, I believe, the CU School of Engineering and became an electrical engineer. And he worked for companies like General Electric, but he became an inventor too. And he had a number of patents. So this was a guy who was really smart and did well in the business world. And what we learn a lot in his book about that isn't quite so apparent in Johnny Burroughs' book is the skiing in the Steamboat Springs of that time. Marcellus loved to ski, and he learned to ski jump, and in later years he founded an award for the longest standing jump on Howson Hill every year. And he made a medal, in fact, that he gave to each person. In those days it was just guys who jumped because they thought women couldn't take the punishment of a ski jump. But
All right.
yeah, but finally they let women jump when they decided to do away with ski jumping, or at least downplay it, because they all do these flips on snowboards now. Anyway,
Hallelujah.
Marcellus made a medal that he gave out, and I think his book is worth looking at because it's full of all kinds of details about the steamboat of that time, and it has this emphasis on skiing. So just thumb through it and you'll see some photographs of early skiing in the area. The next writer,
Minus women.
he was born in 1905, so he comes along a little bit later than Johnny and Marcellus, but notice that he's still within a few years. He's only 3 years younger than Johnny, and so he knew the other two, they knew him, and I'm not sure about Kerry and Marcellus, but Kerry and Johnny Burroughs stayed friends their whole lives. Kerry Mcwilliams was the son of one of the wealthiest ranchers in Routt County, wealthiest cattlemen. And they had lots of money, and they built a house in town here, or bought one, I'm not sure which, but they had a house in town as well as the ranch, as I understand it. And Kerry grew up here. He went to the University of Denver, and I'm not sure he actually graduated from DU. I think he might have gotten into some trouble of some sort, but he decided to go to Los Angeles, and he did. And when he was there, he became a journalist, and he studied or did some reporting on migrant labor in the fields of Southern California. And that led him to write a book called Factories in the Field. And some of you may have heard that title because it was a book that John Steinbeck turned to when he wanted to get more information for his great novel, The Grapes of Wrath. After living in Los Angeles for a number of years, Kerry Mcwilliams went to New York, and he became the editor of The Nation magazine. Now, The Nation is a leftist publication, was then, still is, and I figure that Kerry Mcwilliams and I are probably the only two leftists that ever came out of the Steamboat school system, but there we are. He managed to escape being tarred and feathered, and knock on wood, so have I, unless you people have some tar and feathers with you today. Anyway, Kerry was well known nationally, and when he retired, he wrote an autobiography of his life. And I had to fudge again to fit him into this list, because his account of his childhood is only one chapter in this book. But I think it's worth reading it, even though he doesn't give a whole lot of details, because he covers his whole childhood in one chapter. But I'd like to read for you the concluding part of his memories of his childhood. He says, "Growing up in such an extravagantly beautiful, long isolated, sparsely settled mountain paradise," that's Steamboat, "induced in me as a youngster a strange sense of timelessness. The steep slopes of the Continental Divide seemed so close you felt you could reach out and touch them. The flat-top wilderness area had such harsh and rugged contours, the mountain lakes, parks, and streams, such pristine purity, that one had the feeling the region had always been like this and would never change. It never occurred to me to contrast the geological age of the region with the age of the settlements. The mountains were millions of years old. The settlements dated from 1875 or thereabouts. To me, the settlements seemed as timeless, as resistant to change as the landscape. So when this very special pastoral world of the open range cattle industry suddenly and dramatically collapsed, the shock was the greater for being wholly unanticipated. I learned once and for all that social structures are transitory, and that even a mountain can change in meaning and appearance. Witness what has happened to Mount Werner.
Mount Werner. Oh, is that bad?
Along the Yampa River by Jerry Nish, we learn about a childhood in Steamboat during the 1930s and 1940s. And this book, like some of the others, was put together by the son of Jerry Nish. He wrote out the stories in it, and it was published in 2007 by his son Stephen Nish. And those of you who know the Nish family out in Pleasant Valley, this is a different family. I am staying with Ed and Ursula Nish, and Sancy Nish Berry is here today. And when I asked Ed about Jerry Nish, he said he kind of vaguely remembered him. Sancy, do you have any memories of him?
No memories of Nish.
Well, it's understandable, and I'll try to tell you why I think it's the case. Jerry Nish's grandfather was a coal baron in Scotland, and his son founded the coal camp at McGregor. And And then the family moved to Hayden for a while, and then to Steamboat for a while. But they moved around a lot in Steamboat, and they'd go back to McGregor and Hayden. So they were always kind of in transit. And this collection shows that life in Steamboat had changed from the early period that we've just been talking about. And what was the biggest change? Cars. I mean, there were a few cars in Steamboat when those other three riders were still around, but not like there were cars in the 30s or the 30s and 40s, and a little bit into the early 50s too. So at the end of this, Jerry Nish tells us that he and some friends went to Craig to pick up some girls for a dance in Maybelle. And the dance lasted until the wee hours, and on the way home, these were teenagers, they all got kind of hungry, so they stopped at the ranch of one of the girls, and they had pancakes, and then the guys decided to go swimming in a pond near there, and then they were all so tired they decided to sleep for 3 hours, and the uncle called some of the parents in Craig and said, "Don't worry, your girls are okay. They're all here on the ranch. They're all taking a nap right now. They'll be home by and by." So that was a kind of life Jerry Nish led, and that's why why Sancy and Ed probably don't remember even meeting him. But Stephen Nish also tells us that his father taught physics in Wisconsin and in Washington. He doesn't say anything more than that, so I don't know whether he taught it at a university or a high school or what, but apparently he taught there. But in the summers they would come home to a place near Clark and spend their summers there. Let me just tell you about one, and the stories in this book, and there are maybe 75, 80 of them, something like that. They're all very short, some of them only half a page. And one of them is called Butcher Knife Creek. And that caught my eye because my family lived on 6th Street in a house that Butcher Knife Creek ran behind. Jerry Nelson tells us that he used to walk down to the old Harbor Hotel, and he'd go to a place where Butcher Knife Creek ran into the Yampa River, and he'd cut a willow limb off a bush and take a piece of string and put a hook on the end of it and a worm, stick it in the water there, and he said he was pretty sure he would do this early in the morning, late at evening, and he was pretty sure he would catch a fish, and he usually did. And when he did, he would pull that out of the water, and the tourists who got off the bus to go into the Harbor Hotel for the bathrooms and for food and so on, they would see him do that, and they'd go down there and ask if they could take his picture. And he would say, "Well, sure, if you'll pay me a nickel." And he said, you'd be surprised at how many would pay him a nickel to do that. And in the 1930s, for a kid, a nickel was worth something. So it's a lot of fun to read his collection too, and look at some of the photos in there, because he and his high school sweetheart, who eventually got married, they look to me like the quintessential 50s Bobby Soxers, early 50s Bobby Soxers, just right out of a movie.
Where was McGregor?
Where was McGregor? I'm not sure I remember. Was it down there near Mount Harris somewhere?
Up the hill from Mount Harris. Mount Harris is down here. McGregor's up on the hill.
That's right. Yeah, I was up the hill from Mount Harris, which doesn't exist anymore either. So
Yeah. Probably not the best landmark to use.
Yeah, that would
this
think
next
so.
book Well, it's a crime that it ever made it into print. But I'll tell you how it did. I had published some other stuff as an academic through university presses and stuff like that. And when I got the idea to string together some tales of my childhood in Steamboat, I thought, you know, I just don't think a university press is going to be interested in this, and I doubt that a commercial publisher in this day and age will be either, because there's no money in it. Books like this might sell to a limited local audience, but mostly, if people want to get it into print, they have to go to a publisher that they pay to publish it. And some of those publishers are really good. Some of these books went through that process. And you do get the benefit of an editor sometimes, and their expertise in putting a book together. But I had learned about something called self-publishing on Amazon. So I thought, well, I'd like to try that, see if I could do that. It's a miracle that I ever managed to get something done on that, but I somehow managed to do it. But the thing looks more like some kind of automotive manual than a book. And the cover is a kind of ugly green and this putrid yellow. And it didn't get my middle initial in there, and I always liked my middle initial because, believe it or not, there are more James Maguires in this world than you would ever believe. And if you want to stick around after the talk's over and listen to me for another hour, I'll tell you some stories about James Maguires. But I got this published by Amazon, and then discovered that Amazon, I went to the local bookstore here to see if they would be interested in selling copies. Stupid. Amazon has put out of business thousands of little independent bookstores like Off the Beaten Path. So when the manager heard me say the word Amazon, she almost killed me, and I wouldn't have blamed her if she had. And unfortunately, she can't sell the book, and the only place you can get it is on Amazon. So, but it's here, and it tells about what my childhood was like. And I would, since there's somebody here that I tell the story of one of my adventures with him, I'd like to read that, and I'd also like to read a story about Ed Nish and the chocolates. Ed was not just the kind of guy who engaged in an adventure with chocolates, and one of the culprits in that story is here today, so she can verify this. But Ed was also a rocket scientist at the young age of 14 or 15, and he asked me and a guy named Wayne Pickerel, who I'm sorry to say died last year, he asked us if we'd like to join his rocket club, and we said sure. And the result you'll read about in this copy of the article that showed up in the Steamboat Pilot. And the reason I'm handing this around so you can see it is that when I did some checking on facts for this, I went to a very, I think, remarkable and incredible website on History Colorado. That's the name now for the Colorado Historical Association. And if you go to their website and type in historic newspapers, that will take you to another page, and that page will take you to a search engine, and you can select the Steamboat Pilot from a list of other Colorado newspapers, and then you just type in whatever you'd like to know about and the dates when you think it might have been in the paper, and the search engine will turn up hits, and it's easy to locate something. And while I'm telling you that, I forgot to mention that Lalita Crawford Pritchett has a website devoted solely to her, not on History Colorado. This is a separate website, I think probably set up by her grandson, James L. Crawford, not her grandson, grandnephew, James L. Crawford. If you go to Lalita Crawford Pritchett, just run those 3 words together, .com, you will find a site and then click on books, and it gives you a copy of the 2 books I mentioned and lots of her historical booklets. You click on those and they are all on screen. You can read them there on the screen. And there's also on that page a biography of her. It's a short one, only 25 pages, but that's where I picked up some of the information I've told you about. So, without further ado, let me read to you about Ed and the Chocolates. Ed and the Chocolates is on page 57. The Nishes used to invite us out to their ranch. When I say us, my sisters were about the same age as Lenore and Sancy Nish, but they wouldn't invite all of us at the same time. And I was invited out once, and I'll just start with what I've written. The next big event in the summer after 2nd grade was a repeat of my visit to the Nishes ranch. When I got there, I felt much more at home than I had the year before, probably because I had gotten to know Ed better at school. I was pleased that I remembered how to get on a horse, how to gather eggs, how to open and close different kinds of gates, and how to avoid getting scratched and cut by barbed wire. Ed and I walked all over and did so much that first day that I had no trouble getting to sleep, and this time we slept in the ranch house. Ed woke up before I did, and I was still so fast asleep that he just dressed and went downstairs to occupy himself while I got more sleep. I was still sleeping when he came back upstairs, so he woke me up and whispered, "Follow me, and don't make any noise." We tiptoed down the stairs, and Ed led me into his mother's sewing room. He pointed to a closet, and speaking in a quiet voice, he said, "I've got something neat to show you." He opened the closet door, moved some cloth, and picked up a large box of Russell Stover chocolates. I already knew how special those were. He took the cover off and revealed a layer of assorted chocolates that made my mouth water. Remember that we hadn't yet had anything for breakfast. "Do you notice anything?" Ed asked. "No," I said. "Well," he said, "I've already eaten a couple of chocolates. But you didn't notice they were gone, did you?" "No, I didn't," I said. Then Ed popped another chocolate into his mouth and said, "Now watch this." He proceeded to move the remaining chocolates around in such a way that I couldn't see any noticeable gaps left by any missing chocolates. "Here, have one," he said. I didn't need a second invitation. Ed had another chocolate too. Once again, he rearranged the chocolate so skillfully that it was possible to think none had been removed. We helped ourselves to another. While we were savoring our latest choices, Ed's sister Lenore walked into the room and saw what we were doing. To buy her silence, Ed had to let her take a chocolate, so we joined her. Of course, she wanted another, and got it, and we joined her again.
Oh my God.
At some point, Sancy, still only 3 or 4 years old, came in and wanted some chocolate too. Wasn't long before there were so few chocolates left that we ate those too. I started to worry, and I asked Ed, What do we do now? Your dad, won't your dad and mom be really angry? Ed just reached into the box and pulled out a paper that was a divider between the top layer of chocolates and the bottom layer. Ed pointed out that when his parents opened the box and looked inside, they would think that what they saw was the only layer. That sounded plausible to me. And when Ed said we could have some more chocolates, that seemed reasonable to me too. Since I now knew he was very skillful at rearranging those chocolates. I suppose by then we'd started to fool ourselves into thinking we were still safe. So we kept on eating the chocolates until finally we could see that there were too few left to fool his parents, so we ate those few as well. Now I thought we're really going to get it. I'm sure Ed could see how concerned I was, but he didn't seem at all worried. He put the top back on the box and put the box back in the closet where he found it. Whoever put the box in there probably forgot about it, he said. And when they come back to get it, they'll open the box and just figure that they must have forgotten that they ate the chocolates. I wasn't reassured for long, however, because one of Ed's sisters had gone to his mother and squealed on us. His mom was soon looking into the box, and you didn't need to be Sherlock Holmes or Nancy Drew to see that she hadn't forgotten anything, and she knew what we had been up to. I didn't think things could get any worse until I found out this wasn't any ordinary day. It was Bill and Betty Nish's wedding anniversary, and Bill had bought the chocolates for Betty. I was on a quick ride home after that, but as I say in the book, the Nishes were very kind and forgiving people, and they ultimately forgave me, and I was invited back to the ranch again. But I had to go to a different source for forgiveness about this next story, and this involves another person in the audience here, Moose Burroughs. Many of you know him. He was just Burroughs to me back then. I say Burroughs because in our class there were 5 or 6 Jims? So whenever a teacher said Jim, we'd all jump up. So we started getting called by our last names instead of first names. But this story takes place when we were in our sort of preteen age, I think. And yeah, I was either 12 we were either 12 or 13 that year. I'm not sure. But the event is so vivid in my mind that when I think of it, I can see Jim Burroughs ride up on his bicycle, hop off it, and say, "Look at this, Maguire." He put his hands in his pockets, and when he pulled them out, they were filled with coins, nickels, dimes, and quarters, mostly. "Wow, where did you get all that?" "From the slot machines out back of Mr. Durham's house." "Well, did you have to put money in the slots to get all of that?" "Nah, I just took a crowbar and a hammer and knocked the backs off the machine." "Won't Mr. Durham be mad at you for doing that?" "Ah, he doesn't care. Those slot machines have been out there for years. And he doesn't even cover them when it snows in the winter." Just then Burroughs had an idea, and he looked like he just found a way to make a good thing even better. "Hey," he said, "I only took a few of the backs off. You want to go up there with me so we can take all the others off? You can have half the coins." "Sure," I said. We hopped on our bikes and headed to Withers Hill. When we got to the Burroughs house, I could see that sure enough, the slot machines were next door in Mr. Durham's backyard, and the backs of a few of them had been pried off. We grabbed the crowbar and hammer and went next door, where we went to work with a will. No one seemed to be at home anywhere nearby, and we worked uninterrupted until the sun started going down, and it was time for me to go home for dinner. When I got back home, my shirt pockets, my pant pockets were bulging with coins, and my baseball cap was full as well. I remember shouting, "Look, Mom! Look, Dad! Look at what I've got!" And I remember the silence that followed my shout. The look on my parents' faces told me that something was very wrong. "Where did you get all that money?" was their first question. And when I explained everything, I heard from them once again the lesson I should have learned when I took the candy bar as a small boy. Never take something that doesn't belong to you. We were soon in the car heading to the Durham's house. As my dad knocked on the door, Jim and his parents joined us. Mr. Durham invited us all to come in, and then Jim and I said, "We're sorry, we broke your slot machines and took the coins." Then we returned all the coins and promised to pay for all the damage we had done. Now, more than 60 years later, I can't recall whether Mr. Durham was angry or amused. Do you remember, Jim? I don't even remember how much we had to pay or what we had to do to make restitution for our destruction of the slot machines. But I do remember two of the consequences of what we had done. The first is that I have never since taken something that didn't belong to me. The second is that I have always felt that Jim Burroughs was luckier than I was. Why? Because he was a Methodist and I was a Catholic. I had to confess what I had done. And he didn't. That next week when I went to confession, I dreaded telling kindly old Father Prinster what my sin was. I already knew I was a sinner, and Father Prinster knew I was too, since I had told him my sins every time I went to confession. This time I said, "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. It has been 2 weeks since I've been to confession. These are my sins. I pushed my little sisters in church, I sassed my mother, and I was late getting home last Wednesday, and I helped Jim Burroughs take the backs off the slot machines in Mr. Durham's backyard. But we returned the money and apologized and agreed to make restitution, and for these and all my sins, I am truly sorry." After I finished, there was a moment of silence, and Father Prinster said, "What?" I had to repeat 3 times what we had done before he finally seemed to grasp what had happened. He told me that for my penance I would have to say 3 rosaries and never do anything like that again. I was relieved that it was all over and that Father Prinster hadn't damned me to hell for all eternity. Well, here's a copy of this great mistake, and I'll pass around a picture too that will show you what we looked like when we were in junior high and practicing for football. I was given the nickname, my first nickname was Snaggletooth, because I fell and knocked half my tooth off in the 2nd grade, and the dentist wouldn't put a cap on it for some reason. He said I'd have to wait till I was 16. So all my classmates, as classmates will, called me Snaggletooth. But when I got to junior high, my nickname shifted to Magoo, and you'll see why, because I'm kind of nearsighted, so I had to have glasses on when I played football even. But this was before I got contact lenses later on. But the glasses I wore had these big rubber things as rims, and the glasses were about that thick, safety glass, so they couldn't be broken. So I did indeed look like Mr. Magoo. I still do now, but for different reasons. But. Okay, so the next book on the list is one of the best of the bunch. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, you're good.
I've gone on too long as it is. But let me say a little bit about these last two books. Rio Williams was the only African American girl or boy in the Steamboat school system when I was a kid that I remember. And she and her great aunt Daisy were also Catholics. Rita was in my sister Mary's class, so I knew who she was, but I never really got to know her because I didn't pay attention to girls that were more than a year younger than I was. That wasn't going to happen, so it didn't. But she wrote a book about her experiences with her Aunt Daisy, and her childhood was not so pleasant. Her father ran off and left Rita and her mother at her Aunt Daisy's, and then Rita's mother died when Rita was only 6. So she was raised by Daisy, and Daisy had no experience as a parent and was pretty harsh on Rita. And so a lot of her experiences in Steamboat weren't that pleasant. If you're wondering how she was treated by people in Steamboat, she does mention that she did hear the N-word occasionally, but for the most part, she said people didn't give her a bad time, and there were quite a number of people in Steamboat who helped her out, especially Charlotte Perry and Portia Mansfield. And I won't tell you, well, something terrible happened to her when she was, when her Aunt Daisy had sent her to a boarding school in Boulder, and it actually happened, the incident happened in Denver. She was raped by an African American boy, and she got pregnant, and she gave the child away. She survived all that. She went on to go to Western State in Gunnison to college, and she must have gotten a really good education there, because she then went to Los Angeles, where we're told she became an actor, a musician, a radio announcer, and a couple of other things. And when she wrote this, she wrote for small pieces for magazines in the LA area. This was her first book. I don't know if she's written another one yet. Maybe some of you would know. She came here to Steamboat after the book was published, so some of you might have met her then. What can tell you that this book is really of interest to a national audience is that Oprah picked it as one of the books she recommended.
Their book club.
And Oprah had her on her show. And Rita later wrote for Oprah's, a piece for Oprah's magazine. I think it's a beautifully written memoir. Again, you don't learn a lot of details about Steamboat, but you get a sense of what it would have been like for an African American child in Steamboat in the late 50s and the 60s here, and what she had to go through. And the last book on the list is by Dorie De Camelus, and it's called My Steamboat, A Ski Town Childhood. And Dorie was born in 1963, she tells us, at Dream Island Trailer Park. And her family then moved to a house in Old Town, and after they lived there for a few years, her parents purchased some land up Fish Creek Falls Road, and I think she says the house was on Huckleberry Lane. And my late friend John Wither and his wife Cindy, I live pretty close to there. I haven't had a chance to ask Cindy if she knows Dorie, but you people may know her through her father's, because De Camelus is not her maiden name. Her maiden name is Duckles, and her father was Fred Duckles, he was in my cousin Van's class, and her mother, Mary Ann Duckles, was in my class and Moose Barrow's class. And if I'm remembering our high school yearbook correctly, she was the homecoming sweetheart, wasn't she? Yeah. Anyway, Dorie gives us a perspective on childhood in Steamboat in the late 1960s, 1970s, a little bit of the early 1980s. And the town, as you know, changed very rapidly during that period. So she had a somewhat different experience. She learned how to ski, but she didn't like skiing that much. So like her father, she played basketball. And that was something new in Steamboat because girls, there were no girls sports when I was in school. The girls got to be cheerleaders and that was about it. Which wasn't fair. But she also gives us a sense of how a native of Steamboat felt about what was happening to the town in terms of people moving in and that sort of thing. And it's clear that she makes it clear that she sort of resents the newcomers. And I think that's new too, because in earlier generations, probably because the town wasn't so crowded and so on, and there weren't that many newcomers coming in, there wasn't that sort of a feeling. But it's there a little bit in her book. Anyway, I'll pass that around. And I'd like to hear your comments. I'm sorry I rattled on for so long. I tried to warn you, but I'm interested to see what thoughts you have, if any of you knew some of these writers, and if I said anything that's mistaken, please let us know. I'd also like to know why you think it is that a town with a population as small as Steamboat's was, and relative to bigger cities now still is, why so much has been written about childhood in a place like this?
Because it's unique.
Well, so any questions, any comments?
No, I thought you were wonderful.
Well, thank you.
Great background, and the way you tell a story is very interesting. And I would say keep up the good work and keep informing people about the origins of Steamboat Springs.
Well, thank you.
And